watching Daybreak on A News. I'm Bakhtiar Sanova, and let's take a look at the top stories shaping today's global agenda. Iran says it has reached a preliminary deal with Oman, but questions remain over security and the U.S. role. Ukraine is urging NATO allies for urgent air defense support, warning a shortage of interceptors is costing lives. And Israel has resumed strikes on southern Lebanon, blaming Hezbollah for violating a ceasefire despite U.S.-backed talks. Our top story this morning, and there could be a possible breakthrough in efforts to restore shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran says it has reached a preliminary understanding with Oman on a new navigation arrangement, but questions remain over security guarantees and the role of the United States.
Iran says it's reached an agreement in principle with Oman on a proposed shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. It marks a potential step toward restoring commercial traffic through one of the world's most important energy corridors. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said Tehran and Muscat have agreed on the route's geographical coordinates and are finalizing a joint statement covering technical, legal, security and environmental aspects. A senior Iranian diplomat said the two sides reached preliminary agreement on nearly all key issues, including entry and exit routes, after more than 3 weeks of consultations. Under the proposal, the current temporary northern and southern shipping lanes would be replaced by a single route through Iran's territorial waters for 2 to 4 months, while talks continue on a long-term arrangement. Baghaei, however, said the agreement alone would not guarantee safe navigation, claiming that U.S. military activity and the naval blockade of Iranian ports remain security concerns. The announcement follows weeks of Omani-led mediation, while U.S. President Donald Trump says negotiations are making progress and that talks seem to be working out quite well. Tehran continues to deny direct talks with Washington, saying discussions are taking place only through Oman. Meanwhile, Tehran has warned Gulf states that any renewed U.S. strikes could lead to retaliation against American assets and energy infrastructure across the region, urging countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to help prevent further escalation. The Strait of Hormuz carries around 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments, making its reopening crucial for international energy markets.
Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says the United States and Israel had planned to take control of Iran within 48 hours. Speaking in a national address, Pezeshkian accused Washington and Tel Aviv of seeking to weaken Iran and create divisions. He said that despite recent challenges, Iran remains a strong and respected country. The remarks come as Tehran and Washington continue discussions over the future of the Strait of Hormuz. The US and UK have discussed the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz at a meeting between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his newly appointed British counterpart Ed Miliband. The UK Foreign Secretary said the reopening of the key waterway is essential. Nick Harper sent this report from Washington, D.C.
The US and UK's top diplomats grappled with weighty issues. Marco Rubio and Ed Miliband have met before, but this was the first time with Miliband in the Foreign Secretary role. This is also his first overseas trip in that new position, after he was appointed to the cabinet role by the new UK Labour Prime Minister Andy Burnham. Iran, Gaza, Ukraine, all topics on the discussion list. On Iran, Miliband said that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is essential to bring down global energy costs. On Ukraine, under President Donald Trump, the US has wavered in its support of Kyiv. The UK's position is that support for Ukraine is vital to help uphold security for both Europe and the United States. But as well as dealing with those issues, Miliband had to mend difficult personal relations with the US, undertaking something of a diplomatic repair job following criticism he made of Trump as far back as 2016. He was reminded of that criticism while in Washington. When the two men briefly appeared before the media, one reporter asked if Miliband would apologise for his previous comments in which he called President Trump an idiot, a racist and a misogynist. Miliband and Rubio ignored the question, while the UK Foreign Secretary instead said that they were looking forward to their meeting. The White House, though, had reportedly signalled its concern about Miliband's appointment, considering his previous criticism of the US leader. Miliband, in his previous role as UK Energy Secretary, was a proponent of climate change initiatives, including building more wind farms. But that's something that Donald Trump is vehemently against, this week saying any country with a windmill is a loser. Nick Harper for A News in Washington, D.C.
The United States has lifted sanctions on Iraq's Fly Baghdad Airlines and two Boeing 737 aircraft, citing changes to the carrier's operations. The U.S. Treasury says the airline addressed conduct that led to restrictions that were imposed in 2024. Officials said the move followed major operational changes but did not explain what they were. They stressed the decision doesn't reflect any shift in U.S. policy towards Iran and is unrelated to negotiations with Tehran over a possible deal to end hostilities in the Gulf. They also warned sanctions could be reimposed at any time. Now we have a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss the rest of the global stories. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak. Now let's have a look at those global stories. Russian strikes on Ukraine's eastern city of Balaklia killed 3 people overnight, according to local authorities. Rescue teams worked to extinguish fires and clear debris after homes were hit. The latest strikes come as Russia's defense ministry says its forces hit 3 more cargo vessels in the Black Sea, without providing further details. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military intelligence says a North Korean missile unit has begun deploying to western Russia. Officials say the country could be equipped with dozens of ballistic missiles and launchers for possible strikes against Ukraine. Ukraine is urging its NATO allies to urgently boost air defense support, warning that a growing shortage of missile interceptors is costing lives. Kiev is also seeking a long-term deal to produce US-designed Patriot missiles to strengthen its defenses.
Ukraine received only a third of anti-ballistic missile interceptors in 2026, as it did in 2025, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday. The scale of the shortage was underlined the same day when Ukraine failed to intercept 24 ballistic missiles launched by Russia.
Since the beginning of 2026, Ukraine started receiving about, and it's important that Anatoly Mykolaievich is here, he will confirm this, the head of the Air Force, Ukraine started receiving just a third of the anti-ballistic missiles.
During a Wednesday meeting with Britain's Defence Secretary Wes Streeting in Kyiv, Zelensky warned that Moscow was likely to expand its ballistic missile production.
That they don't want to stop, and I think that they want to continue and to increase escalation, yes, using the ballistic missiles. And we have our estimation, I want to share with you, we have an estimation that they will increase the production of such ballistic missiles.
Zelensky also spoke with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte on Wednesday about obtaining more interceptors from countries with missiles available for transfer. He called for bureaucratic obstacles to be removed, while Rutte said he was discussing Ukraine's urgent air defense needs with NATO allies. Meanwhile, the United States is continuing talks on allowing Ukraine to manufacture Patriot PAC-3 interceptors, despite President Donald Trump casting doubt on such an agreement last week. Options under consideration include producing components in Ukraine for final assembly in Germany, adding Kyiv to an existing American-European program, or allowing it to manufacture a cheaper PAC-3 variant. However, even if an agreement is reached, the first missiles are unlikely to become available for at least a year, leaving Ukraine dependent on immediate transfers from Allied stockpiles.
Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council has approved a resilience plan for Kiev aimed at preparing the capital for possible threats during the autumn-winter season. During the meeting chaired by President Volodymyr Zelensky, officials reviewed the implementation progress of resilience plans for individual regions and cities. The aim is to protect critical infrastructure, expand shelter capacity, and strengthen air defenses. The move comes as Ukraine prepares for possible Russian strikes on energy facilities. Over to Germany, and the Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt says an explosive-laden drone found near a runway at Leipzig airport represents a hybrid attack, saying it marks a new level of danger. The unmanned aircraft was discovered in a restricted cargo area, forcing authorities to suspend flights and divert aircraft, including DHL cargo planes. Bomb disposal experts secured the device. While some airport operations resumed by Wednesday morning, one runway remained closed as an investigation continued. Federal authorities have since opened a counter-terrorism investigation. Speaking to reporters, Dobrindt urged caution.
All current speculation regarding the explosives, the construction, the question of the drone, the origin and, of course, who is behind it, is now part of the investigation and should be left to that investigation. Any speculation on these matters may not be heading in the right direction, could simply be completely wrong. The priority right now is to investigate in all directions.
Spain is grappling with the aftermath of the recent migration surge into Ceuta on the border with Morocco. There are more than 1,000 unaccompanied minors and political divisions deeper over their relocation.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where Spain is still dealing with the consequences of last week's migration surge into the North African enclave of Ceuta. About 72,000 migrants crossed from Morocco, and authorities are now urging Madrid to transfer roughly 1,100 unaccompanied minors to mainland Spain. Most adults either returned to Morocco or left voluntarily, but unaccompanied children cannot simply be sent back. Spanish law requires authorities to identify them, assess their circumstances, and safeguard their rights before any return is considered. That's overwhelmed Ceuta's reception system, with many children housed in makeshift shelters or sleeping outdoors, and in some cases, in cars provided by Ceuta's residents. Under Spain's recent immigration reforms, unaccompanied minors are meant to be transferred to other regions within 15 days once their cases are processed. However, officials say identification and assessments can take months, leaving Ceuta under prolonged strain. Spain pledged 25 million euros in emergency funding, but implementation has become politically contentious, with conservative and far-right parties divided over accepting more migrant children. The surge has also reignited questions about Morocco's role as Europe's gatekeeper. Spain and the EU have long relied on Rabat to curb irregular migration, but Ceuta shows how quickly that partnership can come under strain. The border crisis may be easing, but the political one is just beginning. Ceuta now embodies Europe's toughest migration dilemma, securing its borders while upholding its humanitarian obligations. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Migration has again become one of Europe's biggest political challenges. A record surge of people into the Spanish territory of Ceuta has sparked humanitarian concerns, diplomatic tensions, and renewed debate over how the European Union protects its external borders. So why did this happen?
One border, thousands of crossings, a political storm across Europe. Ceuta is a small Spanish exclave on Morocco's Mediterranean coast. Home to around 85,000 people, it received almost that same number of arrivals in just a few days. Its location has turned this tiny territory into one of the European Union's most strategically important frontiers. In late July, around 72,000 people entered Ceuta from Morocco, the territory's largest mass crossing since 2021. Many swam around Tarajal Beach, while others climbed the border barriers, overwhelming reception facilities and security forces. The crossing also claimed lives. Ceuta, along with neighboring Melilla, is Spain's gateway into North Africa. As Spanish territory, both cities form the European Union's only land frontier with the African continent. Their status remains contested. Morocco says it's their territory. Spain says they have belonged to Spain for centuries, are not recognized by the United Nations as occupied territories.
To describe what happened yesterday as an attack, a violation of Spain's territorial integrity. Ceuta is a Spanish city, and what happened yesterday deserves our strongest reproach and our firmest condemnation.
No single factor explains the sudden influx. Spanish officials point first to a Supreme Court ruling issued in June. Under that decision, people arriving by sea cannot be returned immediately. Instead, every case must undergo an individual legal assessment. But authorities say trafficking networks falsely presented the ruling as proof that anyone reaching Ceuta would be allowed to stay. Attention has also focused on Morocco's role. Some analysts argue a movement of this scale would have been difficult without the knowledge of Moroccan security forces. Even so, Madrid has not formally accused Rabat of deliberately facilitating the crossings and says there's no public evidence. Economic realities also played a significant role. Many people were driven by unemployment, low incomes, and the hope of better opportunities in Europe, while rumors on social media suggested the route had become easier. The Spanish government responded by deploying additional national police and civil guard officers, reinforcing the border with military personnel, expanding reception centers, strengthening operational coordination with Morocco. A request from Ceuta to declare a national state of emergency was rejected, with Madrid saying the legal threshold had not been met. Moroccan authorities say they are continuing to cooperate with Spain, while blaming human trafficking networks for exploiting vulnerable migrants. Those without legal grounds to remain are expected to be returned. But before that can happen, each person must be identified and individually assessed. Asylum claims will be examined separately, while unaccompanied minors remain protected under Spanish law. Spain and Morocco have also agreed to accelerate return procedures, although legal reviews mean the process is likely to take time. The events have reopened long-standing disagreements over how the bloc should manage its external borders. Italy accused Spain of failing to contain the influx. Rome has even suggested Spain's Schengen membership, allowing the free movement of people between certain countries, could be reconsidered. Finland backed that position. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen instead called for faster returns. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz expressed support for Spain, saying effective protection of the EU's external borders is essential to reducing irregular migration. Madrid rejected Italy's criticism, arguing that unilateral measures cannot solve what it describes as a shared European challenge.
Much of Europe continues to face extreme heat, with soaring temperatures prompting health warnings, disrupting daily life and increasing the risk of wildfires.
Italy has placed all 27 of its major cities under the country's highest heat alert as a fourth heat wave of the summer intensifies. The nationwide red warning, the first to cover every major city this year, means prolonged high temperatures pose a health risk to everyone, not just vulnerable groups. Residents have been advised to avoid direct sunlight during the hottest hours, remain indoors where possible, and stay hydrated. The extreme conditions have also reached the Vatican, where Pope Leo's first weekly general audience after the July break was moved indoors instead of being held in St. Peter's Square. Pilgrims arrived carrying umbrellas, handheld fans, and bottles of water as temperatures continued to soar. The scorching weather is being felt across much of Central Europe. In Poland, Warsaw reached 36 degrees Celsius, around 13 degrees above the seasonal average, with cooling mists offering relief to residents and tourists alike.
There is a lot of humidity in the air, so it makes so terrible the weather with the hot and all these kind of things. We were expecting like a colder weather, and also we have seen that tomorrow you have like heavy rains forecasted. So let's see what happens, but really different from expected.
In Czechia, Prague climbed to 33 degrees, prompting charities to distribute water and food to homeless people while encouraging them to seek temporary shelter from the heat. Elsewhere, Hungary has extended its highest nationwide heat warning until Friday, as record low water levels on the Danube forced the country's only nuclear power plant to largely shut down, increasing pressure on the electricity grid. The government has urged households and businesses to cut power use, while non-essential lighting at state buildings is being switched off overnight. The drought has also brought an unusual sight, with millions of mayflies swarming along the Danube during their brief breeding season. Forecasters expect the current spell of extreme heat to peak this week, with several countries warning that temperatures could climb even higher before conditions begin to ease.
With heat waves accounting for around 95% of extreme weather death in Europe, how is climate change reshaping life across the continent, and what can governments and individuals do to cope with? Joining us from London is Thorin Govind, a pharmacist and health commentator. Ms. Govind, welcome to A News. It's great to have you with us.
The concern that we have, of course, is that some temperatures are well above 40 degrees C. Average temperatures are more than 10 degrees C above the norm in parts of France, the UK and Spain. And what we've particularly seen in England is that the interim data for summer 2026 indicates that 2,700 excess deaths estimated during the severe heat weather that we've had during May and June. So this is putting challenges not just on resources but also on healthcare systems.
So temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius are becoming more common. What happens to the human body when extreme heat continues for several days, particularly when temperatures remain high overnight?
Yes, exactly. And in environments which are not catered for heat, particularly in the UK, where we're trying to preserve heat, that means that nighttime temperatures can be increasing. There's increased demand on electricity resources in areas, drought, and also we are also managing wildfires. When it comes to the human body, of course, heat exhaustion can take over and people can experience symptoms like tiredness, dizziness, feeling sick or even being sick, and excess sweating.
Ms. Govind, who is most vulnerable to extreme heat? We often hear about elderly people and children, but what about pregnant women, people with cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, outdoor workers, and those living in poorly insulated homes?
Absolutely. So these are patient groups that we have to be even more aware of. Now, when it comes to heat stroke, this is a medical emergency where you must call the emergency services, and that is an extreme high body temperature above 40 degrees C. People can have hot, dry skin. That can result in a lack of sweating, confusion, and in some cases seizures and fitting. these are groups, so vulnerable groups are also include babies and under fives, as you say, people working outdoors. It's very important that we plan ahead and we think about when we are traveling or when we are in these environments, how we can all protect ourselves individually, making sure that we are drinking enough water, but also recognizing the signs and concerns in those around us as well.
Ms. Govind, but heat doesn't only cause heat stroke. How can prolonged high temperatures worsen heart disease, respiratory problems, kidney conditions, diabetes, and other existing illnesses?
Well, exactly. We need to think about a whole body approach to this. And what I also want to just highlight to the viewers as well is you may be taking medications, and it's very important that we keep, when you come into a healthcare setting, we try and keep the temperature that those medications are kept in under 25 degrees at least. It's very important that you don't leave any medication in cars, and that you make sure that they're stored in a safe, dry place. It can be an issue when things are stored in bathroom cupboards. So it's not just a case of managing people's conditions and keeping an eye on these people. It's also a case of looking after the medications, and in some cases, many of those conditions can have items which are kept in refrigerated as well. So it's very important that we're monitoring our fridge temperatures as well.
So Europe is also experiencing drought, shrinking rivers, and increasingly severe wildfires. What are the less obvious health consequences of these developments, particularly through smoke, pollution, dehydration, and contaminated water?
Well, exactly. I think we have to think more globally as well when it comes to heat change and climate change. These are becoming increasing issues. And if we look back at the data, in fact, from summer 2025 in England, that there was 1,504 heat-related excess deaths during the heat waves. I think the issue is that we often think in isolation, and actually we need to be thinking about a more global approach when it comes to climate change, and particularly when it comes to healthcare.
Ms. Govind, wildfire seasons are starting earlier and lasting longer. How dangerous is wildfire smoke for people living hundreds of kilometers away from the actual fires?
I think we can, depending on how close people are, again, heat and smoke can then create problems for those who already have breathing difficulties. I encourage people to think about where they are in position to these issues, if they can move themselves away, because even if they're not very, very close, you are obviously experiencing the contamination in the air.
Climate change is also affecting mental health and well-being. Can repeated heat waves, evacuations, wildfires, and fears about climate change contribute to anxiety, stress, sleep problems, or other psychological impacts?
I think we don't recognise enough the impact of sleep being disrupted, and as we know, sleep can have an impact then on our mental health. When it comes to sleep as well, particularly environments where we're not used to heat, in the UK, for example, again, we are seeing increased pressure on our electricity resources, also rising costs when it comes to sourcing fans, for example. So we also need to think about health inequalities, because money is then having an impact on people's ability to be able to care for themselves.
Thorin Govind joining us from London. Thank you very much for your time and for helping us understand the growing health risks associated with Europe's changing climate. It was a pleasure having you on A News. Over in Lebanon, and fighting has flared again along the border with Israel, killing 2 Israeli soldiers. It's despite US-backed negotiations in Rome, which sought to end cross-border hostilities. The United Nations warns the situation remains fragile.
Ongoing diplomatic efforts between Israel and Lebanon gave way to renewed military action on Wednesday after Israel launched targeted strikes in southern Lebanon. Tel Aviv says they were in response to what it described as a Hezbollah violation. Authorities confirm 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. The Lebanese Health Ministry says one person died and 12 others wounded in the attack in the southern town of Tibnin. Before the operation, the Israeli military issued its first online evacuation warning in more than a month, telling residents of the village of Mansouri, about 25 kilometers from Tibnin, to leave. It said it would act against the Iran-backed group in the area. Video from social media showed plumes of smoke rising over Mansouri after the strikes. Reuters verified the location using satellite imagery and topographical features, while NASA detected thermal activity in the area on the day of the operation. The strikes came a day after the latest round of US-facilitated talks in Rome, where technical delegations from Israel and Lebanon resumed discussions aimed at advancing security arrangements along their border. The United Nations says the evacuation order for Mansouri is the first displacement order issued by the Israeli military since the latest ceasefire announcement on the 19th of June.
This new order comes as displaced families have been cautiously making their way back to their homes in southern Lebanon in recent weeks, underscoring how fragile the situation remains and the uncertainty that people continue to face. Hostilities continue to affect civilians in southern Lebanon.
According to the United Nations, around 1,500 people were living in the village at the end of July. It says families who had only recently begun returning home now face renewed uncertainty as shelling, demolition operations and other military activity continue to damage homes, farmland and civilian infrastructure.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has denied reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confronted him during a recent meeting in Washington over his criticism of Israel. Vance said the two had a nice and frank conversation, noting that while Israel is a close U.S. partner, the interests do not always align. He said disagreements can be addressed through direct talks, adding that his priority remains advancing U.S. interests. The meeting followed Vance's criticism of Israel over an alleged online campaign targeting U.S.-Iran negotiations. South Korea's record-breaking heat wave is forcing people to find creative ways to stay cool. As unprecedented heat wave warnings expand to more parts of the country, one former gold mine has become an unlikely refuge for the scorching temperatures.
Deep underground, Gwangmyeong Cave has become a cool refuge as South Korea endures a record-breaking heat wave. The former gold mine, just south of Seoul, maintains cool temperatures throughout the year, offering visitors respite from the extreme summer heat. As temperatures soar above ground, people have been flocking to the popular tourist attraction in search of relief. Among them was 78-year-old Ha Young-jin.
It feels great. It's like stepping into a refrigerator. With global warming and the climate changing like this, I think it's only going to get harder if temperatures keep rising. We humans have to find some way to deal with it. After all, this is a climate that we humans have damaged.
Temperatures reached 42.5 degrees Celsius in Yangsan in the southeast of the country on Sunday, the highest recorded in South Korea since observations began in 1904. The city registered high temperatures above 40 degrees for 5 consecutive days. The Korea Meteorological Administration issued its first ever warning for parts of Seoul and neighboring Gyeonggi before extending it to the Chungcheong region. South Korea's president has called the heat wave a national disaster and urged authorities to step up support for those affected after scorching conditions were blamed for 19 deaths.
And now we have a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss the key regional headlines. Welcome back and thank you for joining me this morning. Let's turn to the region now. Armenia and Turkey have held a second meeting of a joint working group focused on restoring the historic Ani Bridge on the shared border. The restoration protocol was signed by the country's special representatives in Yerevan on Tuesday as part of ongoing efforts to advance Armenia-Turkey normalization. During the meeting, the two sides pledged to continue efforts toward its swift implementation. The Ani Bridge project is seen as a step toward strengthening cross-border cooperation between both countries. So how significant is this latest step, and how close are the two countries to turning normalization into reality? Joining us from Baku is political analyst Ulvia Zulfigar. Ulvia, thank you for making time to join us on the program.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
Hello. Ulvia, let me start with the Ani Bridge itself. How significant is the joint restoration project, not only as a cultural initiative, but as a political symbol of the changing relationship between Turkey and Armenia?
I think what makes it significant is that we are beginning to see the normalization process move from diplomatic statements into something much more practical. So the protocol signed on May 4 created a framework for the two countries, two sides to actually work together to bring officials and technical experts together. So discuss implementation and deal with every concrete issues. And this latest meeting in Iran showed that the agreement maybe is not simply remaining on paper. So perhaps the most important element is the habit of cooperation that this project creates. Turkey and Armenia have had very very limited institutional interactions for decades. So when officials begin meeting regularly, technical problems are solved jointly and agreements are actually implemented, a certain level of predictability develops. So that matters because normalization usually doesn't happen through, one political decision. It often develops through a series of smaller steps that gradually make the largest political decisions easier. So I see the Ani Bridge project as a part of a broader process. It doesn't mean that Turkey-Armenia normalization has been completed. Clearly it has not, but it demonstrates that both governments are preparing the practical and institutional ground for a different kind of relationships if the wider political conditions allow it.
Ulvia, Ruben Rubinyan played a central role in the normalization talks and has now been selected as the ruling civil contract party's candidate for Speaker of Armenia's parliament. What does this political rise tell us about the importance Yerevan attaches to the Turkey track?
I think it's significant. Also, I would be slightly careful about drawing a direct casual relationships between his role in the negotiations and his elevation to speaker. Rubinyan is obviously a senior figure within Armenia's ruling political establishment. So his appointment reflects consideration that go beyond Turkey. But at the same time, the fact that someone who has personally managed one of most sensitive diplomatic tracks for several years has now risen to such a senior institutional position certainly tells us something. So he has accumulated direct negotiations experience with Ankara, and he has developed a working relationship with Serdar Kılıç, and perhaps most importantly, he represents continuity. So Turkey knows him, the Armenian government trusts him, and he understands both the political sensitiveness and the technical details of this process. Actually, Serdar Kılıç's reaction to Rubinyan's elevation was quite revealing. He publicly, we know that, congratulated him and referred to the productive working culture they had developed for years. And that tells us that this dialogue is no longer simply an occasional diplomatic contact. A working relationship has been established between the two sides. But I think there is also a broader foreign policy dimension here. Armenia today is trying to diversify its external relations and reduce the vulnerabilities created by decades of regional isolation because of this occupation policy.
So, beyond the Ani Bridge, there are discussions on the Kars-Gümri Railway, the Marmara-Alican crossing and other connectivity projects. Which of these initiatives could have the greatest practical impact on Armenian-Turkey relations and the wider South Caucasus?
Actually, I think this is one of most interesting aspects of the process, because if we only ask whether the border is formally open, the answer is still no. But if we look underneath that political headline, quite a lot has been happening. I will be a little bit wide on this. The two sides have been working on the technical requirements for the Gümrük-Kars railway. They have discussed the Margara-Alican crossing and the infrastructure necessary to make it operational. They have worked on the any bridge project, visa procedures for diplomatic, special and service passport holders have already been simplified. So there has also been progress in air connectivity, and more recently we have seen steps facilitating direct trade between Turkey and Armenia, even though goods still physically transit through third countries because the land border remains closed. So there is a pattern here. The two governments appear to be preparing the infrastructure of normalization before taking the final political step. And I think this is quite rational. Imagine that tomorrow there is a political decision to open the border, but the railway is not operational, customs infrastructure is not prepared, and the relevant institutions had not coordinated their procedures.
Yes.
The political announcement would have very limited practical value. Instead, what we are seeing is almost the reverse. Prepare the railway, prepare the crossing points, establish administrative mechanisms, expand airlift, etc. And then once the political conditions are there, the transition towards an open border can happen much faster. So this also has a regional dimension. The Gümrük-Kars railway, for example, should not be viewed simply as a railway between the two neighboring countries. If regional transport links are eventually restored more broadly, Armenia could become part of a much larger connectivity, networking involving Turkey, Azerbaijan, and ultimately Central Asia. So I would describe the progress as incremental but tangible. The border is still closed, and therefore we should not pretend that a full normalization has already happened, but the infrastructure and mechanisms required for normalization are gradually being assembled.
Julia, from Baku's perspective, what would a fully normalized Armenia-Turkey relationship mean for Azerbaijan?
I think that this is an extremely situation. I would say that these two tracks are very closely synchronized, perhaps more closely today than at any earlier stage of the process. Turkey has its own bilateral dialogue with Armenia, of course, but Ankara has repeatedly made clear that it doesn't see Turkey-Armenia normalization in isolation from the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace process. And politically, that is understandable because Turkey and Azerbaijan have an exceptionally close strategic relationship. And at the same time, the situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia today is fundamentally different from what it was several years ago. We are no longer discussing an active military confrontations. There are direct contacts between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There is practical economic interaction, and the text of the peace agreement has already been initiated in Washington. So we are much closer to formal peace than we were when the Turkey-Armenian normalization process began. But there is still one fundamental issue from Baku's perspective I'd like to stress, and that is the removal of territorial claims against Azerbaijan from Armenia's legal and constitutional framework. This is extremely important to understand. Azerbaijan's position is not simply that Armenia should make another political declaration recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. Official Baku wants the legal foundation of the future relationship to be unambiguous. The concern relates particularly to the reference in the preamble of Armenia's constitution to the 1990s Declaration of Independence, which contains language concerning Karabakh. So therefore, if we are talking about a final peace treaty intended to close this process permanently, there cannot simultaneously remain a constitutional or some legal reference that can later be interpreted as a territorial claim against Azerbaijan. I'm sorry. Prime Minister Pashinyan, we saw that, has spoken about constitutional reform, but Azerbaijan has made it clear that a publication of a draft alone would not be sufficient. The relevant provisions need to be formally removed through a legally valid process. And once that happens, I think the political environment changes substitutionally. The peace agreement can be formally signed, and that would remove perhaps the most important political obstacle to the full implementation of Turkey-Armenian normalization, including the border. So yes, the tracks are separate diplomatically, but strategically they are deeply interconnected. And I think official Ankara's message has been fairly consistent. Progress with Armenia is possible, and we are already seeing it. But the decisive breakthrough will come when the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace process reaches its formal and final conclusion.
Ulviya Zulfikar, political analyst joining us from Baku. Thank you very much for talking to A News. We truly appreciate your time and insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you. The United Nations says terror group ISIS continues to pose a serious threat to international peace and security, despite years of counter-terrorism pressure. The UN warned that while counter-terrorism operations have disrupted ISIS leadership, the group's structure has become more dispersed and remains resilient. Officials at the Security Council said the threat is particularly acute in parts of Africa, especially the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. They also warned ISIS is adapting to new technologies such as artificial intelligence, encrypted communications, social media, and gaming platforms. Pakistan and the United States have reaffirmed their counter-terrorism partnership following high-level talks in Washington, D.C. Both sides agreed to strengthen border security and disrupt militant networks amid renewed attacks in Pakistan. Mariam Zia has the details from Islamabad.
Senior officials from Pakistan and the United States met for the fourth bilateral counter-terrorism dialogue in Washington on Tuesday, reaffirming their partnership. The talks were led by Pakistan's Special Secretary, Ambassador Nabil Munir, and U.S. Coordinator for Counterterrorism, Ambassador Gregory Ligerfo. In a joint statement released on Wednesday, the two governments reaffirmed their resolve to confront Daesh Khorasan, Al-Qaeda, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or TTP, and the Balochistan Liberation Army. Both countries also agreed to strengthen border security and disrupt terrorist facilitation networks. Pakistan's Foreign Office said they discussed regional and global terrorist threats and pledged to deepen counter-terrorism cooperation both bilaterally and at multilateral forums. The dialogue comes as Pakistan faces a renewed wave of militant attacks, particularly in its northwestern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and southwestern Balochistan provinces, with both countries seeking closer coordination against evolving transnational security threats. Mariam Zia, A News, Islamabad.
Elsewhere in Central Asia, a long-running border issue is moving towards resolution. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan have begun implementing a land exchange agreement to complete the demarcation of their shared border. Two Uzbek villages, home mainly to ethnic Kyrgyz residents, will transfer to Kyrgyz jurisdiction in return for an equivalent area of land. Fariza Kalimruzina has more.
Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan have begun implementing a border agreement signed in November 2022, under which the two countries will exchange land as part of the final demarcation of their shared frontier. A joint commission has started work in Kyrgyzstan's Kadamjay district, where officials and technical experts will oversee the legal, administrative and logistical procedures for an agreed land exchange between the two countries. Under the agreement, the villages of Chongara and Tashtobo, previously part of Uzbekistan's Fergana region, will come under Kyrgyz jurisdiction. Around 2,500 people live in the two villages, most of them ethnic Kyrgyz. Registration procedures are now underway, after which eligible residents will be able to obtain Kyrgyz citizenship. In return, Kyrgyzstan will transfer an equivalent area of land to Uzbekistan. Kyrgyz authorities say the exchange is part of the final demarcation of the bilateral border and is intended to resolve issues that have remained unsettled for decades. The agreement also includes plans for new infrastructure, 236-hectare land exchange, which is slightly more than 2.3 square kilometers, will allow the construction of a new route, which will improve transport links and significantly reducing travel times in the border region. Arisa Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
That was your latest news update. Thank you for watching Daybreak and staying with me, Bakhtiar Hassanov. Stay tuned for more updates ahead.